I want to read a little bit of Psalm 40 to kind of anchor in. That's why I asked Jordan to play one of my favorite U2 songs, 40. So I'm just going to read the first few verses from Psalm 40 by David. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in Him. So I think I've told you guys that I love to draw doodles. In fact, there are 82 doodles in my book, and my students love to both draw them and make fun of me while they draw them. But what I've provided for you guys are some cards that look like this. So I'm going to take you into my classroom. I'm not a preacher, I'm a teacher. So you will find these on your tables. I'd encourage you to take a couple with a pen, and I want to invite you to draw the doodles as I teach with them. And so doodle number one, this represents and illustrates my thesis for this morning. And it goes like this. Calamity can serve as a vehicle to transport us to a better place. Transportation, as people of faith, is guided and sustained by divine love. And this transportation, it's part of a larger purpose, which is that this transportation is about our transformation. And so the through-line question for us this morning is, what is that transportation both about, and what is that transportation for? This book that I wrote, it's a new way of telling a very old story. In literature, we would call that a story of archetype. You think of the arches in St. Louis, this idea that we keep telling this story over and over again, just in different ways, through and across time and cultures and people. This story that I tell here is not a new story, it's a very old story. It's a story that we find in the Psalms. We find specifically in Psalm 40. If you are familiar with the theologian Walter Brueggemann, he wrote a little small book on the Psalms, and in that book he argues that what we find in the Psalms is kind of a simple pattern, which is the pattern of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. Orientation, disorientation. Those would be Psalms of lament, right? Or the imprecatory prayers and Psalms that Israel's been leading us through. And then reorientation. These Psalms of praise where they've come through something and they look back and they see the goodness and the faithfulness of God. Orientation, disorientation, reorientation. So if you read my book, I talk about my orientation, which is discovering my sense of vocation early in my life. And I want to be careful that we don't think of vocation simply as a job. I like to invoke Frederick Buechner, who said that vocation is when our heart's deepest gladness meets the world's greatest need. Our heart's deepest gladness meets the world's greatest need. And for me, that convergence of the y and x axis of heart and the world was in teaching. And I experienced that moment, that epiphanal moment, seeing Dead Poets Society. Any of you guys seen Dead Poets Society? Yeah, so when I decided to switch from being a marketing major to an English major, largely because of that movie and a professor I had in college, I mean, I literally memorized the moments and scenes in that movie, and then my first couple years, I would literally reenact them. I remember being 23 years old and having a bunch of juniors, and I walked into the middle of the class and I said, "Huddle up!" And they looked at me, "Huddle up!" Come on. I mean, they came closer, and then I just launched into Robin Williams' speech. We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. Now, business, law, medicine, all necessary to sustain love, but beauty, romance, love, this is what we stay alive for. To quote from Whitman, "Oh me, oh my, of the endless trains of the faithless, of the foolish, the cities filled with the foolish, oh me, oh my." What's the question? Answer, that you and I exist, an identity, that the powerful play goes on and you and I get to contribute a verse, that the powerful play goes on and you and I get to contribute a verse. What will your verse be? Most of those juniors looked at me like, he's crazy, absolutely crazy. Okay, orientation, okay, that sense of purpose and intersection. But as my story goes, like the story of all of us, my story took a turn, a descent into the pit, into what Joseph Campbell, in his theory of the monomyth, calls the abyss. The abyss is that moment where all of our illusions of self-sufficiency are destroyed. Right? Our ego, our sense of identity, all of it is stripped away. It's what's been called the dark night of the soul. Now, the truth is, we've all been in the pit. We've all been in this gnarly, dark stuff, haven't we? We've all experienced the disorientation. So as you draw that, I want you to kind of draw a little arrow, and I want you to think of a time when you were in the pit, when you were in the abyss. I want you to write that down. I want you to name it. As you look at your own journey, when have you plunged into the abyss, into what the psalmist here calls the pit? So one of the reasons I wrote this book was because of something C.S. Lewis once said. He said, we read to know that we are not alone. We read to know that we are not alone. So in my book, I experience the pit, the abyss. Ironically, it's like dark humor on Easter. And I know Israel has read a little bit from that chapter, and I don't want to start where I use the F word because my mother's here today with me, and I don't feel comfortable using the F word in front of my mother in church, okay? So we're going to start after that. No, I do not want you to read it. No, I do not. So, but I'm going to pick it up later in that chapter, and I want to just capture my own pit moment. All I wanted to do was join Robert Frost in the dark, snow-covered woods of oblivion, but I couldn't. I had many miles yet to go. I had loved ones who depended on me. Death sleep was not an option, so I opened my eyes and tried to form words. They didn't come at first, but then something in the subterranean depths roiled through the dark dirt soil and geysered up out of me. I just don't know what to do. Next thing I know, I sounded like a wounded, dying wolf. Dad came over, put his arm around me, and let my shoulders heave and convulse into his chest until all the pent-up exhaustion had turned into snot and wet, greenish smear stains on his nicely ironed pink Oxford shirt. Dad, I'm still sorry about that. Eventually, my wolf howling stopped and all went silent, like the silence that settles over dark waters after the storm has passed. Frederick Buechner once wrote, "Pay attention to the things that bring a tear to your eye or a lump to your throat, because they are signs that the holy is drawing near." I'm not sure Buechner had in mind what I unleashed on Dad. It's hard to believe that my swollen face and bloodshot eyes could be a veritable sign of a divine encounter. Holy snot doesn't sound theologically correct. Maybe, though, the holy, if I dare use that word, was how Dad and I held space together in that moment. Or more accurately put, the way my dad held me in that space. Yeah. That's one of the reasons why I want to invite my parents here to be here today, just to want to honor them for the way that they stepped in in the crisis. So I talk about the experience of literally, Dad, I know you remember that. I mean, I just lost my mom. Put your earmuffs on. I lost my shit, you know. I did. I lost my shit. Um, gotta go the other way. And what came out of me, again, is something old and ancient and primal. The Hebrew word in Psalm 40 for cry is the Hebrew word sa'ak. And it comes from the story of the Exodus. You know, in the Hebrew consciousness, the Exodus story was what formed the narrative backdrop of their lives. When you ask the question, what story am I living in? To the Jews, they believed that they were living in the story of the Exodus. That's why the story of the Exodus shows up over 120 times in the scriptures. That's the story they believed it, that they were living in. And in that story, this is where they encountered God like they had never encountered God before. In Exodus 2:23, and it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, Sa'ak, and their cry, Sa'ak, came up unto God by reason of the bondage. Brueggemann, he translates that word Sa'ak as the primal cry that was the beginning of the redemptive history of Israel. It is the primal cry. We all know that primal cry, don't we? As I was thinking about what happened to me with Dad, I was thinking about this particular passage. I was, of course, reminded of Edward Munich's great piece of modern painting, The Scream. It captures kind of the ethos of the times, and again, an old truth being told in a new way, right? We know this story in our bones. I'm on the last chapters of The Island of Hidden Trees, right? It's that scene. How many of you guys are reading that book, by the way? Okay, spoiler alert. There's that scene where Ada, the teenage girl, stands up in her classroom and she just starts screaming until she literally almost passes out. And it goes viral, right, with the hashtag, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" Okay. We know this scream in our bones, right? And in those moments, we draw this, where we are screaming out from the pit. The paradox is that we believe that God is not present in our pain. We believe that we are suffering his absence. Sometimes we convince ourselves that this is almost a form of divine punishment. And yet the paradox is that often these moments of seeming absence are in fact the times when God is closest to us. The theologian and philosopher Abraham Heschel, highly recommend him. God's Search for Man, of course his book, The Prophets. But in his book on the prophets, he talks about how what the prophets were reminding the people of Israel is of what he called the divine pathos. The divine pathos, which again goes back to the Exodus story, which is the idea that we believe in a God who's not an unmoved mover, or what the philosophers call the prime mover. We believe in a God who is the most moved mover. We believe in a God who feels what we feel. We believe in a God who shares in our pain and in our suffering. We believe in a God who is with us in the muck and mire, right? And I think of Psalm 103:8. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness. I think of Isaiah 41:10. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am the Lord your God. I will help you. I will strengthen you with my right hand. And of course, in Psalm 40, what do we see God's hand doing? Pulling him, her up. The divine is not an unmoved mover. The divine is the most moved mover, right? And what we're to be reminded of, again, is that the gospel tells us, right, that the Exodus story that happened back then, the Exodus story happened again. That God came down. The great bald eagles, we'll call it Jesus came, embodying this divine pathos. Henry Nouwen has a little book called Compassion. I highly recommend it. In that book, he writes this: Jesus' compassion is characterized by a downward pull. Compassion means going directly to those people and places where suffering is most acute and building a home there. God's compassion is total, unconditional, without reservation. It is the compassion of the one who keeps going to the forgotten corners of the world and who cannot rest as long as he knows that there are still human beings with tears in his eyes. The gospel is the fulfillment of what we see in the Exodus. This is one of my favorite passages in all the scriptures. Or in Exodus 19, the writer says, "You yourselves have seen." He's again reminding what I did in Israel. I didn't just hear you, and I wasn't just with you, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. I got to draw eagle wings, eagles. So, you guys know I'm a Lord of the Rings nerd. Yes, teach a course on it. Maybe we'll do that back here in the back room someday for Sunday school. The gospel according to Tolkien. But Tolkien, he was inspired by the image of the eagle. In fact, if you know anything about the cosmology of Tolkien's world, the eagles were Maiar, and Maiar were just below the Valar, and Maiar were the equivalent of angels. Gandalf was a Maiar. The eagles were angels in feathers. They were eternal beings. They were sent by Iluvatar, the god figure, to carry out the will of Iluvatar. They were mediators of the divine. They were called on to at times intervene. Right? For Tolkien, the eagles, man, they captured something of the movement of God in our world, a form of grace. Now, if you think about your life, and you think about that pit, and you think about how you got out of that pit, I want you to draw an arrow to those eagles, and I want you to name who were the eagles? What were the eagles that helped pull you out? A large part of what we're called to do is to remember. To remember. And I want you to take a moment, for those of you who've been there, to remember how God delivered you. Can you write down something that symbolizes how you've seen the eagles in your life? So when I look back, man, how did I get from the clinic where I spent 3 weeks trying to stay alive to where I am now? And when I look at who the eagles were, they were people who God worked through. You know, it was my dad showing up on Easter morning to help carry me through that moment where I wanted to die. A month later, when Dad came back and he packed me up and he moved me in with Mom and Dad because I couldn't take care of myself. And my wife and my son didn't know what to do. I think of my best friend Josh. who has been my best friend since he was 13. I've been planning to go see him, and I said, I don't know if I can come see you. And he's like, get your ass on that Southwest plane. You're coming to Grand Rapids. And so I wrote a little chapter entitled Holland, Michigan. And I'll briefly read. Josh had built a recording studio in an apartment space above his garage. He designed the space to serve as a retreat center for anyone needing a place to rest. One of Josh's superpowers was his hospitality. His care reflected his view of humans as integrated wholes. Josh believed that what affects the psyche also affects the soma. This is because we are embodied souls and ensouled bodies. If something goes wrong in the soul, something goes wrong in the body. The Greek verb sozo was used in Jesus' day to mean both to save and to heal. When Jesus healed someone, he also healed their souls. He worked his holy magic to restore the psychosomatic unity. Josh didn't lay hands on me like Jesus did with the sick, but he did something just as sozo-y. For a week, Josh fed me home-cooked meals and hand-picked my local brew. He ground coffee beans from Ethiopia and hand-pressed them for our morning coffee ritual. Each morning, he led me in a whole-bodied breathing and centering prayer. Our daily routine would consist of reading, journaling, napping, listening to music, and taking a walk on the beach or in his neighborhood park. Evenings were often casual and chill. We'd make a fire in the backyard fire pit under a canopy of night, light up a cigar, sip bourbon, and simply linger together in the smoke and silence. Friendship itself can be a form of psychosomatic therapy. For me, Josh offered a space, a rhythm, and an embodiment, a body-soul presence full of gentleness and compassion. Showing up in Michigan with nothing, Josh offered me everything. The Talmud teaches that to save a single life is akin to saving the entire world. If that's true, then Josh saved the whole world because of what he did for me in my greatest need. So we asked the question, then what's the transformation for? See, one of the things the Israelites understood through the Exodus story is that God not only delivered them from something, but God also delivered them for something. When we think about what we're being transformed into as Jesus people, the simple answer is we're being transformed into people that look like Jesus. That's it. C.S. Lewis says that, God has every intention of making us into little Christs. And what was Jesus? And I'll close with this. Jesus, to borrow from Henry Nouwen, was a wounded healer. What are we being transformed into through our suffering? Into wounded healers who are capable of stepping into spaces with people who are wounded and being able to mediate healing just by our presence. Now there's a tension there, right? And that is that in life, we're not just going to always be wounded healers. The reality is that there are times where we will continue to be wounded and we need to be healed. And that's why we come here. We come here because we need people who are wounded healers to heal us, to mediate healing. And then there are other times where we are called to, through our healing, offer to wounded people that mediated healing. Right? That's what we're being transformed into. That's what we're called to. And may we continue on our journey of being transformed into people who are wounded healers. Grace and peace. Amen.